I want that one. Congratulations, guys. Thanks so much.
Welcome everybody. What a moment that was, being handed my Ursula Sea Witch Queen promo card by Ben from Ravensburger. This is the semi-final of the Content Creator Set Championships. There was a top 4 cut after 4 rounds of Swiss. I was the top seed with a record of 4 games and 0 losses. Alphos was the 4th seed with a record of 3 wins and 1 loss. As I was the highest seed, I was able to go first twice in this one without the need for a die roll. I'm up against Alphos, who is a very good player. They got top 128 in Lille, which secured them a Let It Go promo card. He's also a friend of the channel, who is a fellow content creator for Disney Lorcana. If you don't already know them, you should definitely check out their channel. I was very worried about this matchup, as Alphos is playing Sapphire Steel, which is probably my deck's most tricky matchup out of the top 4 decks that dominate the meta. Maybe Bucky would be a little bit more tricky. I am certainly quite well teched for this matchup with cards like Benja. I have 4 copies of Benja in the current list I'm playing, which is going to be, of course, very nice to shut down the Fishbone Quill. Now, Alphos' version of Sapphire Steel is playing a No Whole New World. He's gone for the No Whole New World version of Sapphire Steel, which I didn't know at the time, but that is making the Benja even more valuable because of him relying very heavily on Flaversham for card draw. So, of course, just removing as many of those items as possible. And this was a very nice start for me because I find my Maleficent on turn 1. And a lot of the time in previous metagames against Sapphire Steel, the turn 1 Maleficent wouldn't be all that impressive. They might just answer with a Captain Hook. Maybe they have a Baboom or fire the cannons. But Alphos actually was not running any copies of Baboom, any copies of Fire the Cannons, and I don't believe any 1-cost characters either. So my metacal that quite a lot of players were playing quite greedy decks without many 1-cost cards, 1-cost characters, that is definitely paid off. And in fact, Alphos has told me that since this game, he has adjusted his deck to add in some Fire the Cannons to deal with these aggro decks a little bit more easily. Maleficent's going to quest for 2. Great start for me, especially with no card on my opponent's side of the board there. It's going to be even better. Alphos is marking his hand, which I told him afterwards, I was like, mate, you're supposed to mark your hand with the number of cards in hand. So that's why there's a one die on there. He's just marking his hand to like separate it from the inkwell. But if you do that, usually the custom is to, with the dice, mark how many cards are in hand. It's actually something I was trying to do as well throughout the day, but I was placing it slightly off the camera shot as I didn't quite get the camera set up perfectly for this event. Mr. Smee comes through. It's actually Monsieur Smee. I'm not exactly sure, but it's the French version of the card, which is pretty cool to see. I take a double quest, and this is such a powerful turn. Of course, Maleficent very weak to being removed by the Smee, but I have a plan up my sleeve. In fact, this game, you really see the flexibility of the deck because, and a lot of the other games you've been seeing up against Ruby Amethyst and Emerald Steel, I had a much slower game plan where I relied on a lot of card draw. Whereas here, knowing that my opponent had a pretty slow start, I go full aggro mode. So I spend 2 for the snake, bouncing back that exerted Maleficent, and I ink Friends, which is of course a very good card in a longer game. But here I'm just going for an aggro game plan, and I replay my Maleficent, and it's readied, which of course means it cannot be challenged. So I'm getting so much value out of this Maleficent. It's already quested for 4, and it's back on the board readied. And I also get that Madam Mim on the board as well, which, while I only quest for 1, of course, just has a very nice stat line of 3 strength and 3 willpower. And already, Alphos has got to be pretty worried. Of course, the Queen's Castle on turn 4 is a big threat as well. Mickey Mouse does come through on his turn 3, which is going to be a better ramp option for him here compared with Fishbone Quill, because this Mickey Mouse is posing a threat to remove my Maleficent. And of course, Mr. Smee going to trade into my Mr. Smee, which I'm very happy with. My Smee gained 2 lore. Meanwhile, Alphos did not gain any lore off of their Smee. And that's just because I've been the aggressor in this game. Obviously, I went first, so I had that advantage. But that's the problem here for Alphos, is that I'm applying so much pressure. They do have to take this trade, when otherwise, of course, they'd rather quest. And this is where I think I point out to him, like, why have you got a one die on there, mate? You're supposed to mark your hand with how many cards are in there. You see, you learn something new every day. So I haven't drawn yet. Currently Got a few cards in hand, including a spellbook. This was actually the first time I drew spellbook in the tournament, and it did feel a little bit clunky, but more questing puts me up to 9. And I did also top deck the Queen's Castle at the right moment here as well. So of course, spellbook being uninkable can be a little bit clunky. It's actually possible there's 2 Queen's Castles in my hand. I think I might have even kept one from the mulligan. So I get rid of a baboon. Feels a little bit slow at this point in the game. Of course, I'm anticipating the Mickey Mouse to trade into the Maleficent, and then therefore the baboon could deal with the Mickey Mouse pretty well. But at this moment in time, I don't really care about the Mickey Mouse. I just want to keep developing as many questing threats as possible. The longer this game goes on, the more in Alphos' favor it's going to swing, and I'm going full turbo, full aggro mode. That's the key thing really with this Amethyst Steel deck, is just to judge each matchup. You have a very flexible game plan. You can see against like Ruby Amethyst players, I'm going to be a lot more card draw orientated, whereas here I've gone for a more aggro approach, particularly when going first. This is also a good time to mention, on my new Patreon, I do have a full game available from this tournament, which was my 3rd round game against Ruby Amethyst. That was actually the game for the Ursula. The winner of that was guaranteed to make top cut. And that is going to be on my Patreon. So if you want to go check that out, go ahead and support me on Patreon. That would be much appreciated. I've spent a lot of money on equipment recently, so now I'm recording stuff physically instead of live streams. It makes sense to start making use of the Patreon. So Queen's Castle, of course, going to be getting me some value here, putting me up to 9 lore with a snake still on the board. But this beast is definitely a little bit spooky, of course, potentially getting some card draw. In fact, I'm up to 11. I almost forgot about it there, but up to 11 lore. And in comes the 2nd castle. So I made that decision to ink Baboom in the previous turn. And this is why I just want to go full aggro mode. And that is not a bad hand either. A Maleficent and a Spellbook. I'm definitely a little bit anxious about playing the Maleficent though, because Alphos is going to be on 6 ink next turn, which of course does pose the threat of Tinkerbell, which is pretty much the biggest counter there is to Maleficent. So Alphos is going to draw a couple of cards because of the Beast Tragic Hero, but needs to start sinking in some damage to the Queen's Castles. And I've got that Spellbook ready to go. I am definitely a little bit worried about Alphos having Beast Hardheaded. It's a pretty common card in these Sapphire Steel decks. It's not in his list, but I have no idea that that's the case at this moment in time. So I'm wanting to delay playing the Spellbook as long as possible. Maybe if I see them ink a Beast Hardheaded, that would be the perfect time for me to play the Spellbook down. But just trying to develop the rest of the things on my board first. Alphos going to go ahead and use the Flaversham to draw a couple of cards. Whole bunch of cards in hand. Meanwhile, I'm only on 2 and I'm just trying to dump my hand. I don't care if he's got a bunch of cards in hand, as long as he doesn't have much on the board. Flaversham goes into the Inkwell. And then the Magic Broom is played for 2 ink. I'm feeling pretty comfortable at this moment in time. So Alphos here needs to try and remove the castles and decides to try and do that by removing my snake. Obviously, that does deny 1 lore. And it's a pretty nice play from Alphos because the next turn, rather than Beast drawing a card, when he already has an abundance of cards, it's going to have a 7 strength body instead, which can, of course, remove a castle in 1 single swoop. Mickey Mouse deciding to sink 1 damage into Queen's Castle rather than Quest, which makes sense. But look at that, the double castle putting me up to 16. I have Maleficent, Spellbook in hand, and I've drawn the perfect card at this moment in time. Look at that. Off the top, the Baboom deals with that beast, shutting down that 7 strength, and in comes the Maleficent. I move it into the castle as well. So I decided to prioritize playing the Baboom here instead of the Spellbook. This is, again, I'm a little bit scared of Beast Hardheaded. And I know that if I just remove that beast, then my castles are almost impossible to remove both of them at this moment in time. As good as the Spellbook would have been, essentially putting a timer on the board, again, I was just pretty worried about that beast hard-headed and just wanting to make sure I don't throw the game at this moment in time. Definitely made the right decision there to just get rid of that beast. And that is game 1. Complete aggro game plan from myself. That Maleficent on turn 1 made all the difference, particularly when Alphos didn't have a character on turn 1. That snake bouncing it back on turn 2 was great, and just really utilising the power of the castles at the right time there. Definitely drew very well, but I think I also was pretty aggressive with my mulligan, if I'm not mistaken as well, to try and really find that curve. I knew what I was up against. I knew what my game plan was before going into the game, and the mulligan allowed me to really just take this incredibly aggressive approach. Even just decisions like that turn 1 ink of inking the Tiny Tink Tactician, which isn't doing much in terms of questing. Pretty good decisions. Now I'm going second, so it's going to be a little bit more of an uphill battle for me. I have access to Benja, which I'm pretty happy about. I'm looking at getting rid of quite a few cards there, including a Mr. Smee, but I believe that's because I already have a Smee in hand. So I think it's just Smee and Benja that I kept here and got rid of the rest. And, of course, Alphos going first this time. And I'm a bit miffed. I took a pretty aggressive mulligan, getting rid of 5 cards, but I still did not find a 1-drop. I have 11 of them in the deck. I'm looking for it off the top, and it's still not there. And at this point, I'm not really liking my chances too much without that 1-drop. You saw the difference it could make. The good news for me is I do have Mr. Smee to play on turn 2. If I was relying on a Madam Mim Snake on turn 2, I wouldn't even have a turn 2 play. So at least it's not a complete disaster. And I've got a bit of an interesting inking decision here. I have a couple of goats. I have a Smee Castle as well. I saw that Castle was very impactful in the last game, but obviously when I'm going second, the Castle's not going to necessarily be quite as powerful because Alphos is more likely to have some extra board control. So it's definitely a big decision here. Bell could also go. Benja and Smee, I definitely value quite a lot. Could be tempting to get rid of a Smee since I have 2, but there's definitely the potential of going quite wide in this matchup and quite aggressive with double Smee at some point to try and get in as much questing power as possible. So I think it's really a decision between a goat or a Queen's Castle here. I think a lot of people would be tempted to get rid of the Smee, and look at that, I do after all that. I don't even know if I like that. It's a very tricky decision. Obviously, the goats can help me cross the finish line, but the Smee being able to just be a 2-cost card which quests for 2 doesn't get removed by Grab Your Swords. I'm not sure if I like that ink decision. The turn 1 ink decision is just possibly the most tricky. Like, obviously, at this moment in time, I really thought about it for a long time, and now watching the game back, I'm not even sure if I like the decision. It's super interesting. So definitely the mulligan and that turn 1 ink, I think, are the trickiest decisions you often have to make in Disney Lorcana, and are the ones worth spending the longest time thinking about. We'll see how it pans out for me, though, with that Smee. Could have been a castle, could have been a goat. I think those are the other options. Even the bell. I'm looking at the bell and I'm like, do I really need that bell in my hand, actually? Not convinced. Popsicles galore for Alphos, but still no character on the board. And there's that turn 2 Maleficent coming through a turn 2 late. So, interestingly, if I took 1 extra mulligan, getting rid of either Benja or Smee, I would have found this Maleficent, in theory, a little bit sooner. But definitely want both that Benja and both that Smee. So I think it was super reasonable keeping them in my opening hand. Just got a little bit unlucky not to find that turn 1 play. I do have 11 1-drops, which is a lot. Mickey Mouse comes through for Alphos. Again, probably better than a Fishbone Quill in this matchup, as it's just an extra body on the board to try and challenge things. Although, I don't really have much of a board, so maybe the Fishbone Quill could be a little bit better because it allows Alphos to ramp more quickly. Smee's going to put 2 lore on the board for me. Not the quickest start. I like being a bit quicker than this in this matchup, but could be worse. Certainly could be worse. And now, of course, I've got the next decision on what to do. I ink the bell, the Benja, the Queen's Castle are the options, as well as a goat. The Benja, of course, is most likely what I'm wanting to play this turn, just removing a Popsicle and getting a Quester down on the board. The Queen's Castle is the decision I go for, which is not an easy decision. Castle could have been a really nice play the next turn, but what Castle doesn't really do if I play it on turn 4, it doesn't really help me get any sort of board control. Kind of messing around with Alphos there. I play the Benja, he puts the Popsicle in the discard, and I tell him I want the other one. I'm being a little bit rude. It's just a bit of banter. He's a friend of mine. Definitely nothing too serious. I wouldn't do that against someone I don't know. Actually, I might. But all in good faith. All in good fun. Fortisphere for Alphos comes through. At this moment in time, I thought his Mickey Mouse was signed. That's why I'm like pointing at it, but it just turns out it's just a bit of the card I didn't realize. It's got like some kind of claw on his forehead attached, which I'd never noticed before. But from the angle I was sitting it looked like it was signed, but it was not. That's why I was picking it up. And you can see the value of Benja. I mean, even though it's not doing that much here, just an aggressive quester. If Alphos had played Fishbone Quill on 3, I had the Benja ready and waiting. So definitely the Mickey Mouse was better here for that reason. Alphos deciding what to do with Mickey, of course, could challenge the Smee, quest for 1, or do nothing at all. Doesn't make any sense really to challenge the Smee. So really it's a decision between questing or doing nothing. You would imagine they're going to quest of it, but they decide not to, which is a really interesting decision. I'm not exactly sure why that is. Unless they just played it and I'm being a donut. But yeah, no, it wasn't. He's got a super awkward hand. I don't think he inked this turn, even. Or didn't play anything this turn. Played a Fortress Sphere and that's it. He had a super duper awkward hand. So at this moment in time, I'm literally saying aloud to Alphos, I'm trying to read and predict his hand. I'm like, okay, so Ariel's probably in there. Some other uninkables, maybe like a Lucky Dime. I think it turns out that there's Hades, maybe a couple of Hades in there, but he's not being very helpful with the way he's holding his hand for the camera. I'm getting better at it though. Look at me go. As the tournament went on, I got better at displaying my hand to the camera significantly. I'm learning on the job here. So I have to be a little bit scared of Tinkerbell still, which is putting me off playing cards like Chernobox Followers and Maleficent, which can be removed very easily. I quest with the Benja, just deciding what to do with the Smee. I know I'm always questing with Benja, so just something I like to do is just, if there's something I know I'm always doing, do that first, and that kind of just gives me less decisions to think about. So the Benja's quested, and I'm waiting to decide what I do with Smee. Thinking about what to ink here. The Chernobox is a card I don't usually like inking because if I can just find one spare ink, it's like a lore and card draw. But against Sapphire Steel, it can be very, very easily removed before it gets that card draw with things like Tinkerbell, with things like Grab Your Sword. So I ink the Chernobox and I go for the Merlin Goat. And now I decide to quest with the Smee. Up to 7. So a pretty aggressive start. And I'm even more worried about the potential of Tinkerbell with the fact my Smee is going to 2 damage counters, which is a big reason I didn't want to develop something like the Maleficent. Similarly, the Spellbook could have been a slightly better option in theory than the Goat, because the Spellbook is putting a timer on the board, but I'm still scared of that beast hard-headed. And moreover, in this position, getting the Goat down as a 4-cost character gives me an opportunity to sing the Zeus the next turn, which is spending 0 ink to remove a potential threat that my opponent plays. Of course, Ariel has Ward, so I'm not able to target her with the Zeus, but that was the logic of playing the Goat instead of the Spellbook. If there was something like a Sad Beast, a Tinkerbell can sing the Zeus while still developing another threat down onto the board. Take a double quest pretty quickly, putting me up to 10. But I do have to be careful of this Ariel. She's questing for 5, but here comes the Spellbook. Haven't seen any item removal as of yet from Alphos, and I spend 2 more ink to play the Maleficent and exert the Spellbook, put me up to 11. Alphos with this Ariel down on the board, of course, is going to be wanting to quest, but with the aggression that I'm threatening, might have to consider taking a challenge with the Ariel, which is obviously losing out on 5 lore. That would be incredibly expensive, but that's just what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make things as awkward as I possibly can for them. Threaten to get to that 20 mark. Obviously, when I'm playing Goats and the Spellbook, the closer I can get to 20, the better. And also, if Alphos doesn't have any item removal, as he decides to remove Benja with Ariel, if Alphos doesn't have any item removal available, which I don't believe that they do, then they know that I could just tap this Spellbook 9 turns in a row and I would get there even if they remove everything else. Hades comes through, which I wasn't expecting. The Maleficent does go face down and exerted into my Inkwell. This kind of explains why Alphos had such an awkward hand here. So many expensive uninkables. I think 3 Tamatoas have gone into the Inkwell so far. At this moment in time, he asked me, can I use my Popsicle to heal Ariel? And I was like, nope, you ended your turn. I was being a bit rude, but it was high stakes. But then what I realized is I'm like, wait, actually, maybe I wanted you to remove the Popsicle. So he was playing around a Grab Your Swords. But at this stage in the tournament, obviously, it's super serious. He ended his turn and then he asked, and I was like, no, I'm sorry. I don't want to be rude, but high stakes. Definitely encourage you guys to do that. Obviously, within reason. If it's not like too much of a serious game, I think it's important to have like the good vibes and be friendly. But equally, if your opponent makes a misplay and it's in a set championship, top 4, for example, in an official challenge event, anything where the stakes are high, there's nothing wrong with saying, no, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to allow you to take that back. And if there's any issues, you can just call a judge, explain the situation, and they're going to side with you on that one. Just be nice about it. That's what I have to say. I said, I'm sorry, mate. I'm not going to let you take it back. I do feel a bit rude. And then I was like, actually, maybe I should have let him take it back, because as you're going to find out that Popsicle on the board is definitely better for Alphos than the aerial being healed. So I should have... It was kind of karma, right? I said no, and then it turns out it's actually better for him that I said no. So Queen's Castle comes down. I exert the spellbook for 1 law, putting me up to 12. Now I'm deciding what to do with the rest of my ink, as well as with the goat. Couple of main options with the goat. Of course, well, there's actually 3. I suppose there's 4. I could do nothing. That doesn't really make any sense, but always an option. I could quest for 1. I could sing Zeus and deal 5 damage to the Hades. Of course, aerial has ward, so I can't target the aerial. But the bonus 3rd option, or 4th or 5th, whatever option it was, which is what I decide to go for eventually, I exert it and I say to Alphos, I'm not sure. I'm either going to quest or challenge the aerial. And I do decide to remove the aerial. She's questing for 5 a turn with something like a lucky dime. That means that Alphos has some serious explosive potential. And particularly when Alphos had some issues with inking in the early game, I've kind of got the read that there's a good chance there's a lucky dime in Alphos' hand. So despite saying he couldn't remove that 2 damage counter from the Popsicle, with the Popsicle, the aerial, I just removed the aerial anyway. So of course I should have let him get rid of that Popsicle to heal aerial. But that is karma. That is what I get for being a little bit unsporting. Not really. He did end his turn. I was well within my rights, but it is kind of karma. In comes the Smee, and the big play there with the Rise of the Titans, removing the Queen's Castle. Of course, I have the option of using Rise of the Titans onto the spellbook instead. Hades questing for 2 cards in hand for Alphos. I'm at 3 cards. I play a rabbit, so I remain at 3 as I draw 1, and that's not a bad card to find either. And look, I've got a couple of ink here, and I've got a pretty interesting decision because I want to play the Smee, but I also want to exert the spellbook. So I could ink the goat to enable myself to do that, but of course I don't want to ink the goat. So really, if I'm saying I don't want to ink the goat, I have 2 decisions. I can either use the spellbook and not play the Smee, or I can play the Smee and not use the spellbook. And I decide at this stage in the game, I want to just use the spellbook as often as I can. And so I decide to use the spellbook instead of the Smee, because I want that goat still in my hand. That is a very, very valuable tool. It's basically a minimum of 2 lore, right? 1 lore when it hits the board and 1 lore when it's removed. Tinkerbell gets inked for Alphos. In comes another Hades. Rabbit goes into the inkwell, but it's when it leaves the battlefield, which is what we were just checking here, not when it hits the discard pile, so I do draw as a result. Hades and Smee questing. And at this moment, I call a judge.
Judge! My opponent's winning.
My opponent didn't put a damage counter on their Smee.
I'm used to having a clock. Oh, it's because it's not Smee, it's Monsieur.
I would say that's repetitive. I'm going to give you a warning. Losing for doing it? I'm actually giving you a warning.
Okay, so it was super unnecessary for me to call a judge. I just wanted to call a judge all day. It just seemed funny. Again, Alphos, friend of mine, and he knows it's just me memeing and trying to be funny. I couldn't resist. And Alphos said, "Oh well, I couldn't read my French card. I didn't know." He's also messing around, having a bit of fun with it. But I'm feeling like I'm in a pretty strong position still with the spellbook down. But this Rise of the Titans was definitely a big deal. In comes the goat. I'm at 15. That's not bad. Definitely glad I didn't ink this goat the previous turn. In comes Smee. And now I have enough with that rabbit leaving play. I had some extra cards to ink. And now I'm able to play everything I want while also exerting the spellbook. Quite a lot of cards in hand for me now, including a Queen's Castle. Obviously, Queen's Castle at this stage not great, as Alphos very much has board control. And Alphos is really threatening to get to 20 quite quickly here with that Hades and Smee. They can quest for 6. Something like a Lucky Dime, an Aerial. You can certainly see why I decided to take that trade with the Goat and Aerial. I think it was a game-winning decision. In comes the Dime. Imagine if I'd let that Aerial stick around and Dime and Aerial were gaining 10 lore in a single turn. And look at that questing. 14 now for Alphos out of nowhere. However, I'm in a pretty good position because I can quest with everything. Puts me to 19. The spellbook puts me to 20. I've got the Fox anyway. And I cross the finish line. GG's to Alphos.